How's it going, folks? I'm Matthew. This is Lemora's Cards, and today we're talking about interaction in cEDH. When and how to do it, and how you're messing yourself up in your games. Evaluating whether something requires you to interact, optimizing your play around interacting, and using your opponents to make interacting easier and better for you. If you enjoy this video, like, comment, subscribe. Let me know down below. What is your advice for interacting in cEDH? Thank you to all my amazing patrons over on Patreon for their support. You can get access to perks over there like the private Discord, deck breakdown videos, coaching sessions, all kinds of stuff like that. Also check out my merch. I'm still doing a sale right now. Get the merch while it's cheap. And I think with all that being said, let's go ahead and hop into it. Voting for the Top Deck Invitational player invites has begun. Only 4 players are going to get voted in, and Joseph Fago, also known as Pigeon in the cEDH community, reached out to me to ask for your votes. You can go over to topdeck.gg at the link in the description below. Vote for him while supporting a good cause, with all proceeds going to charity. Help a cEDH player get into this amazing historic event. So the first thing I want to talk about is evaluating whether something requires interaction. And there's a couple different layers to this. I think the most obvious is there's a win on the stack. Yeah, that requires interaction. Now, when we get to using your opponents, we'll talk a little bit more about evaluating that. But yes, if there's a win on the stack, typically, yeah, you're gonna have to bite the bullet and use your interaction. I know you'd rather use it to protect your own win, but you gotta not lose sometimes, right? And if they present wins first, that's how it works. That's not usually the most complicated, although again, we'll get into some of the more political play. But then you have things that are just problematic. Things that don't necessarily represent a win, but could really hinder your ability to win. This could include stacks pieces. Maybe a Sisei casts a Deafening Silence turn 1 and you're thinking about mental misstepping it. And then you're worried about doing that when there's like a rock side going after them and whether or not it's gonna hurt you more than them when, you know, maybe your hand is kind of reliant on casting a couple non-creature spells in your first turn to really get out ahead. A big part of that is knowing your ability to remove something and the pressure you have to remove it. If you're a turbo ad nauseum deck, Deafening Silence is going to be pretty obnoxious for you to handle, especially if it's coming out before your first turn, because a lot of your advantage in that game is pretty much lost if you spend the first 3 turns just land, drop, go, maybe, you know, a mana rock here, a mana rock there. And your ability to remove it might not be that great either. Like if we're looking at Roxai, for instance, you've got like Chain of Vapor, Otawara. There's not a lot. Understanding how that piece is going to affect your game plan is the biggest part of that. The one that can be the most kind of up in the air is a value engine like Rhystic Study, Mystic Remora, things like that. There can be a debate on whether or not it makes sense to use those, especially again, depending on the pod. I think at the highest level, when there's usually like a couple mid-range decks, a turbo deck or 2, you know, something like that, it can be very intimidating to fight over a Rhystic Study and then just lose to the raw Thoracle Consult or Breach Grinding Station win. And a lot of that is about knowing your play, knowing what the game is about. If you think the game is going to be about a resource grind, if you assess the table as not really being that likely to present early win attempts, then it can make sense to start fighting over those pieces, especially if it's like turn 1 Rhystic is, especially on the play, pretty brutal. I could see it. Sometimes it's right, sometimes it's not. And again, it changes too. Like a Mystic Remora coming down before you're planning to ad nauseum, that is going to be brutal. You might as well just use that misstep now if you got it. Though sometimes you can see people choose to fight over things where it doesn't really make sense. For instance, let's say somebody casts a Rhystic or a Mystic and you're untapping after them and your plan is to silence with counterspell backup and then ad nauseum. It makes way more sense to go to your turn and fight over that silence than it does to fight over the Rhystic Study. The silence resolves, you win the game. And at that point, they still, if it's a Rhystic Study, they spent 3 mana to draw 2 cards. They just played a divination. Another big part of understanding interaction is the opportunity cost. Every counterspell you use is a counterspell you no longer have. Weighing that against the potential threats is always going to be a big part of the game. For instance, if there's a Swords to Plowshares in my hand and I'm playing against a mid-rangey, you know, Timna Crom style deck and then some creature combo decks, that Swords to Plowshares that normally could hit a Crom or an Op Agent or something like that, I might be more inclined to save it, especially if I'm playing on the more reactive side, to deal with the Dockside combo that the Teamer deck might present, or Kinnan Basalt Monolith or something like that, because the potential threats represented at that table skew way higher for those creatures, and Crom and other value-oriented things are much less of a high priority. On the opposite end of the spectrum, if I'm playing against a bunch of turbo decks, Swords to Plowshares pretty useless against like a Turbo Grixis deck, and I'm more inclined to just fire it off on a decent value creature that might have come down, or something that's just slowing you down a little bit that isn't really hurting your opponents too much. Welcome to TopDeck.gg, your community's home for everything competitive Magic has to offer. Whether you're hosting an event, playing for a huge prize, or trying to advertise your store to thousands of players, we've got you covered. Using intuitive pairing software, playing Magic is a breeze. All your players have to do is sign up online, then scan the QR code in store. Give your competitors the gift of perfect information as their bracket updates in real time. Then, when the match is decided, our self-reporting software saves you time and leaves paper match slips in the past. Leave the heavy lifting to us so your community can sit back, relax, and have a great day of playing Magic. So let's talk about optimizing your play, and we can think of this in a couple different ways, but one way to look at it is just the best combos in the format. What is the best way to interact with these combos? For Thassa's Oracle, I would say generally you just interact with it the best way you can. The main part of that combo is that the Thoracle tends to be the harder part to interact with because it's a creature, though it is blue, so it is red blastable, but the Demonic Consultation or the Taint Impact is the much easier part to interact with. Typically, you're just going to interact with the part of that combo you can hit, which will usually be the Consult or the Taint Impact, but if you're in a scenario where you're able to really mess with them and, for instance, letting their Taint Impact resolve and then able to stifle their Thoracle trigger or endurance them or do something that will prevent them from winning with that Thoracle trigger, potentially even triggering their Esper Sentinel or Crom, which are both force draws also. Those are the best ways to interact with them, especially if you want that player gone. A lot of times though, if that's like a more mid-rangey or whatever kind of player, you might not necessarily want them dead, but that's the best way to blow them out. Underworld Breach can be tricky as well. It's really dependent on the graveyard and the mana situation. In a position where their resources are plentiful, you absolutely should not let the Underworld Breach itself resolve. If there's a lot of cards in the graveyard, if there's a lot of mana represented, the Breach coming down is going to be problematic. If your interaction is just Besage You, then of course you have to let the Breach come down and know that they are going to get one spell, but if you can, try not to let the Breach resolve. However, if the resources are tighter, it can often be better to let the Breach happen, especially if it's basically all face-up information of what they're going to be able to do. If they're just very tightly doing Breach, Crack LED, and then either tutor for Brain Freeze or just natural Brain Freeze, being able to mess with the Breach itself or the graveyard after they've lost their hand through LED can be the best time to interact. At that point, they're not able to protect anything, especially with free counter magic, other than like Pact of Negation. Basically, none of it works through Underworld Breach. They're going to have to spend mana. Cards to consider here, again, are Endurance. Also, Noxious Revival can really come in clutch here, where they crack LED or they cast Breach with LED already in the graveyard. Noxious Revival to LED, you're kind of screwed unless they just have the Brain Freeze in hand. Lots of different points you can mess with them, though generally either stopping the Breach itself from coming into play is ideal, or getting them into a position where they are completely out of resources and you just super blow them out. Dockside combos can be a little tricky. You could lump in other infinite mana combos here, but I think the Dockside ones can represent the most unknown stuff happening. A lot of times, even a Dockside combo deck can just cast a Dockside and try to do something like power out its commander or whatever, just use the mana. For instance, if Dockside counts 5, doesn't necessarily represent a win attempt, but it is spooky. So the safest thing is to not let the Dockside resolve, but oftentimes that's pretty hard because you have to hard counter a creature spell. If your plan is removal to prevent loops, you should often let them put the trigger on the stack for Dockside and respond there. You don't want them to have more resources to potentially fight that off. Getting them while the resources are at their lowest, in general, is the best way to interact with an opponent. A lot of times though, you'll be in spots where you are worried about Dockside and whether it represents an actual win, or you can hold back your interaction for something else that's actually more threatening. And that's often going to be a roll of the dice. There's going to be a little bit of political play. Ask them what they're doing. Make some of the more political plays there, because it's really going to be hard to know exactly what they might represent. And of course, it can depend on the deck. So we're kind of leaning into the idea of using your opponents a little bit more, doing some of the politicking, getting some information from them. There's a lot of different things we could talk about with this, but there are kind of two main categories I want to talk about, which is using your opponents to your advantage and getting used by your opponents to their advantage. One you want to do a lot of, one you really want to avoid. So there's a couple things that really pop out to me, especially in watching newer players. One, players can tend to be a little antsy about using their interaction. They kind of feel like it's burning a hole in their pocket. They see somebody cast something and then they're just like very obviously ready to respond to it. You don't want to be jumping to use your interaction. I've said before that bad players get to use their interaction. Good players have to use their interaction. That should be the feeling. Shouldn't be excited about stopping a win attempt. You want to be protecting your own. So breaking that habit will be kind of its own thing that you'll get used to as you play more and more. But a lot of times you'll even just see even more experienced players kind of shake up the way that they respond based on whether or not they intend to interact or can interact. A really obvious example I usually see, player 1 casts something scary. Player 2 hasn't said anything yet, and player 3 is like, hey, you're gonna do something about that? Do you have anything? Any response? And just really not necessarily jumps priority, but starts to, although also jumping priority, very, very bad for you. You really don't want the table to know you have interaction. A great rule of thumb is that when you have nothing, you want the table to think you have something. And when you have something, you want the table to think you have nothing. Not always going to be the case, but often I think that's going to get you the results you want. So there are a lot of bad habits with this. Like I said, people kind of jumping priority. That's a major one. That really lets me know you want to do something. And I am very willing to take advantage of you wanting to jump priority because you got a hole burning in your pocket with that this spell that you're running. You're going to get a lot of value out of just chilling and letting your opponents play through the game. And also it's going to be less disruptive to the flow of the game. You'll often also see players who do have something that don't want to use it soft pass on their priority, where they get past priority by the player making a scary play, and then they look at the other two people like, hey, do you guys have anything? And in those scenarios, you want to take advantage of the fact that they are really telling you they have something that they don't want to use. There's a couple different ways you can do this. Some players will just lie. Valid, I guess. A play that I tend to try to use to be very tricky is to show the player a bit of interaction that doesn't stop the scary thing, but could back them up. Deflecting Swat is the perfect card for this. Somebody casts Ad Nauseam. I might show someone before me in priority order, like, hey, I have this. If you guys can fight over it, I can help, and get them to use their stuff. And again, I never said, hey, I don't have Fierce Guardianship. I don't have a counterspell for this. I said, hey, I have this. Is it tricky? Yes. Is it effective? Usually. Is it honest? But you didn't lie. Because that's really what a lot of interacting is. You want to come out on top in terms of the like card advantage, mana advantage war you guys are fighting. If you counter somebody's spell, the other two players who weren't involved in the exchange go up against you. Some smaller things that you could be doing that are letting people have a good idea of what's in your hand is the way that you're pausing when a certain type of spell is cast. For instance, I usually take note if I cast a scary creature and people pass on it very quickly, probably means that nobody has anything for it. And I will try to sort of reverse engineer what they could have, because if I cast a scary enchantment and nobody thinks about it, but when I cast a scary sorcery and people are thinking about it, that might tell me a little bit about what they have. Maybe they have a miscast, something like that could hit a sorcery. Or maybe it's that they can hit my red spells and not my blue spells, things like that. Your opponents are giving you information every time they do everything. When they pause a little bit longer, when they start to tap and then untap, anything they do like that, they're giving you info, and you're going to benefit from taking in as much of that as you can. One last thing I want to leave you on is the knowledge, which may seem obvious, but I don't know, that the stack favors winning. For example, let's say you and one other opponent are the only people representing anything. Your other players are just both F6. They got nothing. If you both have a win plus a hard counterspell, the way that stack is going to play out is the person who sends their combo first will win, because I'm going to play my combo, you go to counter it. Then I counter your counter. We had an even exchange of resources. We had access to the exact same things, but because I played the first thing, I'm favored. You have to have 2 counterspells to beat my threat plus counterspell. Sometimes the way that the cards interact with each other will change this. Cards like Flusterstorm, pretty infamous for being very hard to beat, but in general, you're favored for pushing win attempts because people have to stop everything, try to win with, plus your interaction, and all you have to do is beat their interaction. So let me know some bad habits of interacting you see. That might be something that could be its own video, and just bad cEDH habits in general. Let me know if you want some coverage on that. But I thought I'd take some time to do this kind of short video about interacting and try to highlight some things I think players miss in terms of equity that they might be leaving on the table, because every game is hard. Every game has a million different interactions. The more you know, the easier it gets, and the more you think about it, the trickier you can get with them. And that is the best thing about interacting. The best counterspell is the one that you never had to cast. Thank you so much for watching, and as always, go play cEDH. Have a good one, everybody.